Good evening. Welcome to Simon Fraser. But all of you would rather hear about the history of Iran than the cooking of Iran, which is on at the Chan Center out at that other university. Samin Nosrat is speaking. I had tickets to that too. Anyway, my name is Nader Mirhady. This is the Mirhady Lecture. This is our family doing something good for the Canadian and Iranian communities. I'd like to introduce Dr. Malik Koyagi. I'm bad with names. Teaching for years and years and years, always bad with names. Anyway, welcome all. I hope you enjoy the lecture. But to begin with, let's move on to Dr. Ordubas.
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me in the back? Yes? Okay. All right, so my name is Malik Ortabasi. I'm the Associate Dean of Undergraduate Programs in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. I am here on my own behalf, but I'm also here to send greetings from our Dean, Laurel Weldon, who unfortunately could not be here this evening. And it's unfortunate because she was looking forward to it. But so without further ado, let me do the formal introductions here. So dear guests, thank you everyone for coming out. Mr. Nader Mirhady, members of the Mirhady family, and Dr. Mikiya Koyagi. Let me begin by respectfully acknowledging that SFU is on unceded Coast Salish territory, the traditional territories of the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Coquitlam First Nations. It is my great pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the university to this year's Drs. Fereydun and Catherine Mirhady Endowed Lecture in Iranian Studies. Our distinguished visiting recipient of the Mirhady Endowed Lectureship this evening is Dr. Mikiya Koyagi, an associate professor at the University of Texas at Austin's Department of History. His distinguished lecture this evening is the latest in over 2 decades of important lectures enabled by the Mirhady Endowment. These very diverse and exciting talks have ranged in time from ancient Iran to the contemporary period, covering issues of epic and modern poetry, revolutions, gendered surgery, film, cosmopolitanism, political and literary nonconformity, Persian self-understanding, transnationality, urban identities, and the politics of pop music, among many, many other topics. I'm sure you join me in a deep appreciation of the late Doctors Catherine and Fereydun Mirhady for their generosity in creating the endowment that has made these lectures possible. Their generosity and that of many others in the Iranian community have laid the foundations to build up a quality core of programs in Iranian studies at Simon Fraser University. Persian language courses have been offered over the last 13 years in my own department, actually, the World Languages and Literatures Department. And our library continues to receive gifts of important Farsi language lithographs and manuscripts. Over the next few years, we hope to go further and construct a program in Iranian studies at Simon Fraser University, which is founded on academic excellence and engagement with the vibrant Iranian community of British Columbia. I invite you all to participate in this vision of Iranian studies at Simon Fraser University. It is now my pleasure to introduce Professor Thomas Kuhn. Thank you for telling me how to pronounce your name, by the way, whom I've known for many years, from SFU's History Department, who has coordinated so many of the Mirhady Endowed Lectures since 2014. Thomas.
Good evening, and thank you, Dr. Ortabasi. It is a real pleasure to echo your appreciation of the support of the Mirhady family and the Iranian community. It has been a joy to see the Mirhady Endowed Lectures emerge as one of the fixtures of SFU's outreach over the past 2 decades. I would also like to thank all those who have helped make this event possible. First and foremost, Jonathan Goodlockson, Rebecca Armstrong, Amy Weeblaw, and our graduate facilitators Asu Jawahiri, Ismail Noyan, and Naz Vardar. For this year's Mirhady Endowed Lectureship, the committee decided to address the important yet under-researched topic of mobilities, space and identity, and their role in modern Iranian state building and society from the late Qajar period to the final years of Reza Shah's reign. It did not take long for us to decide to invite Dr. Mikiya Koyagi, an associate professor in the University of Texas at Austin's Department of Middle East Studies, as his work on this aspect of modern Middle Eastern history is truly groundbreaking. Educated at Hitotsubashi University in Japan and the University of Texas at Austin, where he obtained his MA and PhD, Dr. Koyagi has held prestigious appointments as an assistant professor at New York University's Department of Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies, and since 2018 as professor at the University of Texas at Austin's Department of Middle Eastern Studies. He has published in influential venues, such as Comparative Studies of South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, Iranian Studies, the International Journal of Middle East Studies, the International Journal of History of Sport, the Journal of World History, and Modern Asian Studies. He has been interviewed by BBC Persian, Jadaliya, National Geographic, and Voice of America. Dr. Koyagi's research has been funded by New York University, the Swedish Collegium for Advanced Study, and the University of Texas. Dr. Koyagi comes to SFU as the author of a research monograph titled Iran in Motion, Mobility, Space, and the Trans-Iranian Railway that was published to great acclaim with Stanford University Press in 2021. This book has served Dr. Koyagi as the stepping stone towards new, equally innovative work on the connected histories of Iran's eastern borderlands and the history of intra-Asian connections since the 19th century, with a focus on the interactions between Japan and the Muslim world. It is on this topic that Dr. Koyagi will have more to present and to say in the coming days here at SFU. Please join me in welcoming this year's distinguished Mirhady Endowed Lecturer, Dr. Mikiya Koyagi.
Okay, good evening. I would like to thank first Dr. Thomas Kuhn for the generous introduction, and also the Mirhady family for the lectureship, the lecture series committee for inviting me, administrative staff and graduate students, especially Rebecca Armstrong for arranging the trip. And I would also like to thank Associate Dean Melek Urtabasi for her presence today. And of course, I would like to thank all of you for being here this evening. Okay, so as you can see in the title of my talk, I am going to talk about the history of the Trans-Iranian Railway. And I'll just start talking about why I decided to write about it first. I started to think about writing a history of this railway project for a couple of reasons. And I'll start with the least important for me. Can you hear my voice? Okay. I'll start with the least important for me, which is a more kind of personal reason. So academia is my second career. Right after finishing college in Japan, I worked for a Japanese railway company for a couple of years. And so I was curious about what a railway project in Iran looked like, especially since I was being trained as a historian of Iran. But a more important reason I got interested in the Trans-Iranian Railway was my countless conversations with Iranians in Iran and abroad. My first long stay in Iran was 2005. I did a summer Persian language program in Isfahan, and whenever I had time, I traveled to cities like Tehran and Yazd by train. And my friends, many of whom were around my age, so like in the mid to late 20s back then, they would proudly talk about the Puleveresk, or the Veresk Bridge in the north of Iran, as the technological masterpiece of the period. And older generations of Iranians would even cite the exact length of the railway, the number of stations, the number of bridges, and various other factoids about the railway that they memorized at school. And I found it fascinating that many Iranians found a railway project so important in talking about their country, and they often combined it with some sort of political commentary, right? And also during the same stay in 2005, I read an Iranian high school history textbook, which talked about the Trans-Iranian Railway in a very different way. It's a textbook published after the Islamic Revolution, which essentially characterized the railway project as a British ploy to control Iran. So clearly, both Iranian state and society had strong opinions about the railway project. So after I came back from Isfahan, I started to do research, but unfortunately it wasn't about the railway. I had to collect primary sources for my master's thesis, which is about gender and physical education in the Boy Scouts movement in the Reza Shah period. So I read thousands of articles in the Iranian press from the 1920s and 30s to find articles on physical education. But by the time I was done with research, I ended up with hundreds of articles about the Trans-Iranian Railway. Many of them described official ceremonies that celebrated the construction of stations, bridges, and new sections of the railway, usually accompanied by pictures like this one. Some of you are probably familiar with pictures like this, pictures that prominently feature Reza Shah Pahlavi and the Trans-Iranian Railway. The famous ones include a picture of Reza Shah tightening the last bolt of the railway track, or Reza Shah staring at the hand clock while waiting for the departure of a train. And you might also be familiar with pictures like this one, pictures that featured the magnificence of the material structure itself. And these pictures appeared frequently in the heavily censored Iranian press of the 1920s and 30s, and they were accompanied by captions that gave technological factoids about the length of the railway, the number of bridges and tunnels, the amount of cement used for construction, and also, as you might expect, there was always praise to Reza Shah's willpower for making it happen in Iran. So this sort of industrial photography is not unique to Iran in the interwar period, right? Contemporary states across the world showcased their technological achievement to increase legitimacy through infrastructure, from the Soviet Union's Turkcib railway project to Germany's Autobahn. In the case of early Pahlavi Iran, massive material structures like railway stations, bridges, and tunnels evoked a sense of wonder, and coupled with a repeated claim that it was Reza Shah who made it happen in Iran, pictures like this one essentially presented the Pahlavi state, especially the Shah himself, as the creator of technological modernity in Iran. And along with visual evidence that appeared throughout Iran, such as railway stations and bridges, the captions provided this sort of a technoscientific data to augment a sense of objectivity, right? And by doing so, articles in the press presented the successful operations and the subsequent transformation of the Iranian nation as a fait accompli. So the Trans-Iranian Railway was clearly very important for the early Pahlavi state. And in fact, based on my decades of reading the Iranian press from the period, I cannot think of any other state project that was as frequently featured as the Iranian Trans-Iranian Railway. And as it turned out, we knew so little about it. The Iranian friends who would proudly talk about Veresk didn't know, who the laborers were who constructed it, or who the workers were that operated the locomotives, or they actually didn't know the route of the railway itself. So in the process of writing the book, I eventually met a lot of people who are passionate about very specific aspects of the railway project, but still there was no sort of coherent, comprehensive account that gave me a good sense of what the railway project was about. So when I started my doctoral dissertation research around 2008, I had to start finding very basic empirical aspects of the project. So the Trans-Iranian Railway was the first long-haul railway in Iran constructed between 1927 and 1938. And its construction process was ultimately supervised by a Danish consortium called CAMSAX after an original deal with the German-American consortium fell apart. But the railway project was also the mainstay of modernization projects under Reza Shah Pahlavi, which is why it was so important in early Pahlavi state propaganda. And as you can see on this map, the railway connected Tehran with two bodies of water, the Caspian seaport of Bandar-e-Shah, or Bandar-e-Turkmen today in the north, and the Persian Gulf port of Bandar-e-Shahpur, or Bandar-e-Imam Khomeini in the south today. It also went through places like Qom, Lorestan, and Khuzestan in the southwest. So even though it bypassed most major cities like Isfahan, Shiraz, Mashhad, Tabriz, it touched the lives of many groups, including tribes, peasants, workers, vacationers, pilgrims, technocrats, and whatnot. So given the diversity of the places the railway connected and the diversity of historical actors involved, I thought the Trans-Iranian Railway project would be a great lens through which I could write interconnected social histories of modern Iran. So the fundamental question I'm dealing with is, if the Trans-Iranian Railway connected distant places and facilitated the movement of people, goods, and ideas, how did ordinary people experience it? And how did people's everyday life change with the coming of the railway? And what kind of aspirations, anxieties did people have as the railway began its operations in the context of modern state formation in Iran? And I wanted to explore everyday life and the mundane aspirations of the people because I felt like existing understandings of the Trans-Iranian Railway project among both academics and non-academics accepted two fundamental premises of the official narrative propagated by the Pahlavi state. These premises were, one, the Trans-Iranian Railway project was a quintessential top-down modernization project by Reza Shah's Pahlavi state. So some people praised the Shah for building the railway, as some of my Iranian friends who were mesmerized with the Verest Bridge did. And others criticized the Shah for building the railway, as the Iranian school textbook did in painting the Shah as some sort of British puppet. Right? But both of these views share the fundamental assumption that it was a top-down project by the Shah's state, and it's why both of these views equate the railway project with the Shah and with the Shah's vision. The second assumption I want to challenge is that the Trans-Iranian Railway project was a project for the Iranian nation, by the Iranian nation, which largely overlooks the global context in which the project shaped and the participation of thousands of non-Iranians in the early history of the railway. And here I'm not just talking about, the usual suspects, European engineers from places like Germany, Sweden, and Denmark. And I'm not even restricting myself to talk about sort of, Greek, Italian, or other Southern European skilled workers who came to Iran to build the railway. But I'm also thinking about Indian, Iraqi, Bahraini, and many other itinerant workers from neighboring countries. So existing understandings overwhelming emphasis on the state and on the nation, and because of the widespread internalization of these premises, there is a pretty narrow range of questions we often ask about the railway project, right? So sort of common project questions that are raised are, well, did Reza Shah or the Pahlavi state make the right call in building the railway, right? Or was the railway good for Iran? And here Iran presumably sort of refers to the abstracted notion of the Iranian people. And these questions are not exactly my primary concern, so I'll just get them out of the way by succinctly stating my response. Regarding the political and economic usefulness of the railway, I would say that it was politically useful because, one, it legitimized Pahlavi's state and Pahlavi rule by showcasing its technological modernity, and two, it stabilized volatile regions like Lorestan and Khuzestan, not through military suppression, but through the creation of employment for tribal members as construction laborers, especially in the 1930s in the context of the Great Depression, right? But it was economically marginal compared to the highway system. Keep in mind, we are talking about the Inter period, and globally, it's already the beginning of automobilization elsewhere. And also, the railway was not quite militarily useful, at least for the Iranian state. It was useful for the allies. But by the time the Iranian railway began its operation, tribal regions of Lorestan and Khuzestan had been largely pacified. And regarding whether the railway was good for Iran or not, I would say any nation is comprised of diverse individuals, groups, and institutions with competing interests, and the rhetoric to evaluate policy X or Y based on sort of abstracted collective national interests sometimes politically serves as a way to justify certain groups' marginalization, displacement, and all sorts of tragedies as inevitable or even desirable collateral damages for the cause of the nation. So I don't quite deal with this question of whether the railway was good or bad for Iran. I'm much more interested in what the railway project meant and did to different groups of people whose interests greatly diverged. And what did the railway mean to various non-Iranians, from Indian pilgrims to Iraqi workers to Greek stonecutters, or even maybe the ecosystem of a relatively arid, water-scarce region. Just to be clear, I'm not saying focusing on top-down political economic integration is inherently problematic, because the early Pahlavi period did witness rapid expansion of state power. And implementing the railway project did require the involvement of Iranian statesmen, foreign governments. So I'm happy to talk about, say, like how much less representatives or British or Russian officials or investors debated the most desirable routes of the railway, and other sort of similar questions during Q&A. But again, I'm just saying that an exclusive attention to sort of high politics among great men, especially Reza Shah, reinforces this assumption that the processes in which modern Iran evolved was a fundamentally top-down process, right? And it assumes that the people could sort of celebrate or resist these processes, but did not quite shape history in any meaningful way. But it's much more complicated. So even the Tehrani middle class, the prime beneficiaries of Pahlavi state modernization projects, had ambivalent feelings. For many of them, the railway did symbolize modernity. It was something to be proud of nationally. So they expressed excitement for the coming of the locomotive to Iran and for the possibility of traveling by train. But they also complained vehemently about the heavy taxes on tea and sugar that partially funded the project. And similarly, some tribes of Lorestan grudgingly exchanged the loss of autonomy for employment as construction laborers, especially since the alternative was an exile to faraway places like Khorasan and eventual starvation. It's also clear that the Trans-Iranian Railway had to be modified again and again in response to local demands and complaints. Various safety regulations are some of the prime examples of how actual users and operators of the railway, not some sort of abstract grand vision espoused by political leaders, shaped the Trans-Iranian Railway. So paying attention to a diverse segment of Iranian society would allow me to think about how the social and geographical margins shaped big processes in history. So with this general framework, I argue against the notion that the railway project was a linear process of national integration and homogenization, with Tehran as its uncontested center, and instead, the railway unevenly redistributed mobilities, and in doing so, it generated many contestations over mobility. And as a result of this production of the contested mobilities, the railway project connected multiple geographies locally, nationally, and importantly, transnationally as well. Although I would say it's important to stress that the railway did sever other pre-existing connections in multiple spatial scales. So it's, the railway project sort of rearranged local, national, and transnational connections, and I ultimately show that these processes of redistributing mobilities produced various groups of Iranians who are differentiated by their practice of mobility. So in essence, sort of mobility was key to how people defined themselves. I should probably talk a little more about what I mean by mobility and why it's an important concept in the book. So historians usually use the concept of mobility in a more macro-spatial sense. Mobility is often equated with travel and migration. And I do use mobility in this sense, but I also use it to discuss more qualitative aspects of it, right? Meaning how individuals experience travel and migration as they make smaller micromotions. To put it in a more concrete way, let me talk about pilgrim mobility as an example. So the early Pahlavi state promoted tourist mobility, like these tourists, or the vacation of citizens to Iran's historical and natural sites to strengthen their attachment to the nation. So Tehrani middle classes' summer trips to places like Mazandaran would be quintessential form of tourist mobility, because travelers from this travelogues from this period often show how the Tehrani travelers were fascinated by the foresty nature of northern Iran, the beauty of the Caspian Sea, and they strengthened their sense of belonging and attachment to the nation and its land in a very concrete sense, right? But the official discourse viewed pilgrim mobility with more suspicion, particularly transnational pilgrimage to Mecca and Shi'i holy cities like Najaf and Karbala. So this was the case partly because pilgrim mobility was often seen as potentially subversive for the nation by creating competing focal points of citizens' loyalty that transcended national boundaries. In addition to the destination and purpose of travel, there were other reasons why pilgrim mobility was problematic. It was associated with pilgrims' appearance in religious garments in public spaces of the railway, and also with the perception of their behavior in public. So the Iranian press, whose primary readership came from the emerging urban middle class in this period, frequently mocked and criticized what they perceived as disreputable, unmodern behavior of pilgrims. So they noted how pilgrims pushed each other to get on the train, how they spread sofre on the floor to eat meals, or how they were harmful to Iran's international reputation. And travel writings produced by those with urban middle class backgrounds also made comments about different behavioral codes that divided travelers along categories like class, ethnicity, and national belonging, usually discrediting other travelers for not conforming to their notion of respectability. So mobility is not just a matter of travel and migration, right? It was socially differentiated by who exercises it, for what purposes, in what manner, to where, and so forth. It's even differentiated by the question of who gets to move at all, because as I will discuss later in the talk, some people encountered various forms of obstacles in exercising their mobilities precisely because of the railway project. Excuse me. So the set of questions I just asked, like who gets to move, for what purposes, to where, frequently, these are frequently asked by historical actors themselves. And we see countless examples of how advocates of different versions of a Trans-Iranian Railway and the critics discussed this question. For example, among political leaders of the early Pahlavi state, mobility, it was a double-edged sword, right? Mobility was necessary to move troops from Tehran to the provinces to control autonomous centers of power that were still active at the beginning of the Pahlavi period in the 1920s. Well, at least this is the rhetoric that was used in official discourse, if not that's how it played out in reality. Mobility was also necessary to produce a national economy, because the idea of a national economy was predicated on the assumption of a smooth flow of goods across the nation. And equally importantly, mobility was a crucial precondition for the propagation of what official discourse called the new civilization, or Tamaddun Jadid, which was essentially a way of living based on imagined European modernity. And this is why promoting national middle-class tourism was an important part of the Pahlavi state project, so that the middle-class tourists would function as sort of like missionaries of the new civilizational ideas to the rest of the nation. And newspapers like the semi-official Ittelaat they weren't quite subtle about this paternalistic attitude. They explicitly encouraged urban dwellers to travel to the provinces and teach the rural compatriots modern ways of life. So to produce a politically, economically, and culturally coherent national space, the Pahlavi state needed to facilitate the movement of people, goods, and ideas, especially from the capital to the provinces. And again, who moves, for what purposes, to where, all of these issues are central. But at the same time, state propaganda of the time expressed deep anxiety about unregulated mobility. In addition to pilgrim mobility I mentioned earlier, there is tribal mobility. So many borderland tribes had familial ties that transcended porous national borders, and they moved across these borders frequently. They were also seen as too unreliable to be long-term laborers, because at the beginning of the Pahlavi period, they tended to work only temporarily for a brief period for infrastructure construction or maintenance, and then disappear within a week or 2 weeks. And if they practice pastoral nomadism, they would move seasonally. And similarly, by the early Pahlavi period, animals like camels and donkeys came to be seen as an antithesis to modernity. So they were seen as obstacles that kept Iran backward and prevented the acceleration of movement that would be essential for progress. And there are also workers who migrated transnationally, which, workers' transnational migration generated suspicion from the Pahlavi state. Because we should keep in mind that the construction and operation of the Trans-Iranian Railway generated massive waves of transnational migration, especially because Iran did not have enough skilled workers needed for constructing the railway and operating the railway. But the problem was that their cross-border movement could accompany the circulation of ideas like communism, labor activism, and other potentially subversive ideas. And there are indeed numerous railway workers who did take advantage of their rail mobility to connect with comrades across national boundaries, especially once we get into the 1940s. So we see accounts of labor activists traveling from Bahrain and Iraq to Khuzestan, Mazandaran, and even to the Soviet Union. So in a sense, the Trans-Iranian Railway became a corridor that linked labor activists, social democrats, and communists of the Soviet Union and the Persian Gulf, which, unsurprisingly, the Pahlavi state didn't quite welcome. Okay, so the railway project wasn't even intended to produce mobilities evenly for everybody, right? While promoting national scale movement of certain kinds, the state tried to regulate and transform other types of threatening mobility, right? The kind of mobility that did not necessarily conform to the logic of the nation in terms of the spatial scale of their movement, the purpose of their movement, and the way in which mobility was performed. So the idea was to transform nomadic tribes into construction laborers who would, instead of disappearing into different places, they would commute to the construction site every day. It was also about replacing animal mobility with mechanized mobility, and it was about replacing foreign workers with Iranian workers. So in short, the railway project was purported to fundamentally transform mobilities so that the Iranian nation would embody the ideals of the new civilization through the bodies of its citizens. But of course, it would be impossible to mold individuals into these idealized prototypes, right? So this gap between ideal and reality led to constant negotiations between the logic of the nation, mainly expressed in the censored Iranian press, and everyday practices of mobility among various groups of people. So throughout the book, I sort of follow these contestations by studying different groups from tribes, construction laborers, railway workers, technocrats, and travelers. Okay, and at the same time, I cannot stress enough that these contestations were not just between state and society or between the categories I just mentioned, like laborers, workers, travelers, right? Contestations happened often within these categories as well. So for the rest of my lecture, one key theme is going to be these intra-group contestations. And the other key theme is the spatial and temporal frameworks that I employ to understand the Trans-Iranian Railway. And I'm going to discuss my spatial framework first by introducing intra-group contestations over mobilities among railway workers. I pay much attention to the Trans-Iranian Railway's transnational origins and consequences because once I began following mobile individuals instead of official proclamations, I realized the lack of attention to transnational connections was perhaps the most serious byproduct of viewing the railway as Reza Shah's national project. So for example, the rise of the first generation of railway workers is usually associated with the establishment of technical schools by the Pahlavi state in the late 1930s. But the Trans-Iranian Railway was undertaken almost or over 60 years after the rapid expansion of rail and steamship networks in Iran's neighboring regions like India, the Caucasus, and the Ottoman Empire. This means that the railway project necessarily interacted with existing infrastructural networks and with existing circulation of labor produced by them. So early railway workers had acquired industrial experience in Iran's neighboring empires. And by using a series of workers' interviews published in the railway industry newspaper, I show how first-generation railway workers were part of two distinct transnational circulations of labor. So one circulation involved the circulation of labor around the Persian Gulf in yellow. This included the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, where many Khuzistanis acquired their first industrial experience before joining the railway workforce in the 1930s. But there are also Iraqis and Indians, especially Parsis, so Zoroastrians, right, from India. Because of the earlier development of railway systems in India first and then in Iraq under British rule, they were in a unique position to operate locomotives in Iran, at least until the rise of Iranian locomotive engineers in the late 30s and early 40s. So it was Iraqis and Indians who were the very first generation of locomotive engineers. And the other circuit centered around the Caucasus, Russia, and Anatolia in teal. And to talk about the circulation of labor, let me show you an example of an interview from the newspaper Mardan Ruz. So the interviewee's name is Hossein Sayar, a locomotive driving instructor in Tehran at the time of the interview in 1946. He was born in 1896 in Tabriz to a carpet weaver's family, and he worked in agriculture from childhood in his native Tabriz, but he moved to the Russian Empire in 1911 to acquire technical skills. And then he worked for a silver-making factory in Ossetia for 3 years. And then he returned to Iran to work for the newly opened Tabriz-Jolfa Railway, built by Imperial Russia, which connected northwestern Iran with the Russian-controlled Caucasus. And in 1921, he moved back to the Soviet Union to receive a diploma in locomotive driving from the Russian Railway. And then he came back to the Tabriz-Jolfa Railway, which the revolutionary Soviet government ceded to Iran. So by the time the Trans-Iranian started its operation in some sections, which is in the early to mid-30s, he was employed as a locomotive driving instructor. And other early railway workers from Azerbaijan shared very similar life stories of being born into a relatively modest family background, moving to places like Russia, the Caucasus, or Eastern Anatolia, partly because of economic hardship, but also to gain industrial experience around World War I. And so while it is true that technical schools from the Reza Shah period produced thousands of new railway workers by the late 40s, the first generation of workers emerged outside of Iran and prior to the rise of the Pahlavi state. And Iran's ties to Russia and the Caucasus are really crucial in this transfer of railway technical expertise. But these transnational origins of the railway project were gradually suppressed to make the railway properly national. The example of competitions among railway workers give you a sense of how we came to remember the Trans-Iranian Railway as a more exclusively national project. So these competitions happened in the mid to late 1940s toward the end of the Allied occupation. Right? This context is really important. The railway organization expanded drastically during the Allied occupation when the railway was used as a crucial route to transport war materials from the Persian Gulf to the Soviet Union. The number of the organization's employees increased from roughly around 8,000 in the pre-war period to 36,000, which made the railway organization the second largest company in Iran, surpassed only by the Anglo-Iranian oil company. But once the occupation was over, demands for rail traffic dropped. And to make matters worse, the late 40s was also when intercity bus service developed substantially in Iran, making the railway less and less competitive for passenger traffic. And in response, the railway organization began waves of massive layoffs, which was a major betrayal from the workers' perspective, because during the war, they had been told that they would have to persevere and contribute to the Allies' victory so that they would be rewarded once the war was over. Right? But once the war was over, that promise was never fulfilled. And in response, railway workers began to sort of self-narrate their life by emphasizing the sufferings associated with the occupation, especially the national migration in the railway industry publications. And in these publications, workers valorized national scale migration as the most worthy sacrifice for the nation, because they had to live away from the family, often moving to scorching Khuzestan from cooler regions in the north, and they had to survive on rationed bread, contaminated with sand and pebbles. Workers told these stories to prove their worthiness in comparison with other workers whose sacrifices were presumably less profound. And the argument was that because other workers sacrificed less, they shouldn't receive the same kind of perquisites, perks, and compensations from the railway organization. Workers from the north, who had to live in Khuzestan, argued things like southern workers from Khuzestan or Bushehr should receive less perks because the hot and humid climate of Khuzestan shouldn't be a problem for them. Non-Iranian workers were even more actively excluded from the story of sacrifice. Iranian workers from different provinces argued that non-Iranians like Indians and Iraqis shouldn't qualify for perks because they don't belong in the nation in the first place. And these workers' narrations of national migration as a noble sacrifice became integrated into the official history of the Trans-Iranian Railway, sanctioned by the railway organization, which in turn became the basis of Iranian collective memory of the railway as the national project, while erasing the railway's transnational origins. And this is very much reflected in the official history of the Trans-Iranian Railway, published in 1948 to commemorate the 10-year anniversary of the completion of the railway. There's absolutely no reference to non-Iranian workers from India, Iraq, or elsewhere. And the account simply glorifies Iranian sacrifices to build and operate the railway. So to summarize my discussion of this intra-group competitions among workers, we see the emergence of the Iranian national railway workforce by the late 1940s But this workforce rejected the presence of the previously multinational workforce. But we should keep in mind how this emerging national workforce was also deeply divided, not just by more obvious things like rank and skill sets, but also based on the spatial scale of mobility they performed, especially during the occupation. Okay, and regarding the spatial framework of my analysis, I find the attention to these transnational interregional connections so fruitful, especially because too often we think of histories of infrastructure, histories of technology in the non-West by thinking about the West as the origin of technological expertise, and the non-Western place we study as sort of the receiving end that that tries to negotiate with Western knowledge. So history is sometimes sort of reduced to the relationship between the West and a specific place in the non-West we study. But in Iran's case, this wasn't really the case here, right? As you can see in the importance of India or Iraq or the Caucasus or Russia, railway infrastructure project that took so much later than Iran's neighbors' similar projects. The Trans-Iranian Railway project should be sort of situated in many regional contexts, that the kind of regional context that I talked about. Now, I'm going to shift my attention to the temporal framework. And I want to introduce this temporal framework through contestations over mobility among travelers. So a big chunk of my book, 3 chapters out of 7, extensively discuss the 1940s, right? So it's after Reza Shah was forced to abdicate by the Anglo-Soviet invasion of 1941. And I find it really interesting because when I began to work on this project, I thought I was going to write about an infrastructure project of the Reza Shah period. And I ended up discussing the 40s a lot because practices of mobility, like how workers operated the railway, how passengers traveled by train, and how inhabitants along the route used railway facilities, all of these practices evolved only after the railway began to operate. And it's also crucial to keep in mind that the country was invaded by the Anglo-Soviet forces in 1941, only 3 years after the completion of the railway, right? And the Anglo-Soviet forces were soon joined by the American Persian Gulf Command. And for the duration of World War II, Iran's railway infrastructure was operated jointly by the Iranian State Railway and the Allies. So the occupation really shaped the context in which practices of mobility evolved. And most obviously, the volume of traffic skyrocketed during the occupation. Before the occupation, despite the symbolic significance of the Trans-Iranian Railway, only 1 train in each direction operated each day. Right? But with the wartime need to transport the American Lend-Lease materials to the Soviet Union, the Allies initiated massive construction projects and increased the transport capacity of the railway by almost 20 times. So the Trans-Iranian Railway, as we see it today, is as much a creation of the occupation period as it is a creation of the Reza Shah period. The increased traffic due to the war meant many things. For one thing, it meant that there were a lot more accidents. Between 1942 and 47, there were 3,848 major and minor accidents, causing at least 469 deaths and 889 serious injuries. It also meant the need for more workers to operate the railway, which now included Allied personnel as well as the multinational employees of the Iranian State Railway. Like I mentioned earlier, the number of employees at the State Railway increased from around 8,000 to 36,000 by the end of the occupation. Right? For passengers, the wartime traffic meant that they had to share the railway space like stations compartments with the Allied personnel, even though they were spatially segregated in principle, if not in reality. The Allied personnel typically occupied the first and second class cars, while Iranian passengers sat in the third and fourth class cars. So the occupation temporarily created conditions that sort of resembled colonial railways in places like India and Egypt. And my point is that these practices of mobility evolved in this peculiar context, right? And that is one of the reasons we shouldn't end the history of the Trans-Iranian Railway with its completion in 1938. And more generally, I would say it's important to look at contingent processes that unfolded after the forced abdication of Reza Shah in 1941 to get a better sense of longer-term consequences of major modernization projects under Reza Shah. So seeing the Reza Shah's period as sort of a self-contained period of centralization would foreclose that possibility. So with this temporal framing in mind, I want to talk a little more about railway travelers to show two of the central claims I make in the book. First, the railway distributed mobilities unevenly, and second, mobility was central to how people defined themselves. So there are all sorts of railway travelers in Iran. There were vacationers going to the Caspian Sea in the summer or to ski resorts in winter, but they were a small minority among many passengers. There are also local villagers carrying vegetables and livestock. There are pickpockets, allied soldiers, and prostitutes who catered to those soldiers, which is a major concern for both Iranian nationalists who tied female sexual honor to national honor, and for the allies who feared the spread of STDs among soldiers. But the most dominant presence in the Iranian railway space of the 1940s was Shi'i pilgrims in religious garments heading to shrine cities like Qom and also Najaf and Karbala, and to a lesser extent to Mecca. So we should keep in mind the late 40s was just before long-distance international bus service became more prevalent, and also before the proliferation of commercial civil aviation. So despite the Pahlavi state's vision of the new civilization, the railway generated massive pilgrimage traffic. And to meet the demands, in addition to regular rail service, the Iranian Railway Organization provided special services to Qom and to the Atabat, to Najaf Karbala, in fourth-class cars, which carried several thousand passengers every day. And the fact that the railway facilitated pilgrimage to both Qom and the is important. Throughout the 20th century, Qom became progressively more important as Iran's national center of religious learning. And with the opening of the railway, it became much more accessible from Tehran and other parts of the country, making it even more attractive pilgrimage destination compared to more remote shrine cities like Mashhad, which was not linked to Tehran until the 1960s. But the railway also made pilgrimage to the Atabat in Iraq much easier, and the trip from Tehran to the Atabat was shortened from more than a month in the 1910s for various reasons to less than 2 days. So in a sense, the railway pulled Iran in multiple directions simultaneously because people and goods could move to all sorts of directions much faster, right? So rather than thinking about the impact of the railway as simply sort of creating a Tehran-centered national spatial unit by fostering movement from the provinces to Tehran and vice versa, it created many regional routes of circulation, almost sort of pulling the nation apart in different directions in different parts of Iran. Now, I'm going to briefly note how the railway in the specific context of the 40s redistributed mobilities unevenly. So the fourth-class cars was the ones that pilgrims used. They were essentially freight cars without light, without seats, and without ventilation. So they used these cars partly because of affordability, but a more structural issue was the prioritization of wartime needs by the Allies during the occupation. It made regular passenger cars unavailable to many Iranian civilians. And in fact, villagers along the route filed petitions complaining that there were no available seats that they could purchase. So despite having the railway in their village, civilians sometimes just couldn't use it regularly during the occupation unless they chose to freeload, which they did. And when pilgrims managed to get fourth-class tickets, they had to spend about 24 hours without seats, light, or ventilation in overcrowded cars. And to ventilate and avoid excessive heat, passengers often left the doors open. And you can imagine the danger of leaving the doors open on overcrowded freight cars, considering the mountainous, sort of winding terrains of the parts of Lorestan, right? So whenever major accidents happened, victims among passengers came predominantly from Iranians in fourth-class cars. So especially in the context of the occupation, even the safety of movement was organized hierarchically. So if railway journeys revealed the hierarchized nature of mobilities, how did the experience of these journeys shape the identity of passengers? When pilgrims visited the Atabat or Mecca, they usually went to Ahvaz in the south by train, sometimes all the way to Khorramshahr, using the new railway line built by the Allies during the war. And from these borderland cities in the southwest, pilgrims would either find taxis to go to Basra and then take the Iraqi train to the shrines of the Atabat. They could also find small motorboats owned by local Arabs to go to Basra or to Kuwait if they intended to go to Mecca. But the actual process of border crossing was made much more complicated by the control of cross-border mobilities by emerging states, right? Such as the frequent Iraqi refusal to issue visas to Iranian citizens. So thousands of Iranian pilgrims often shared the experience of being stuck at borders for days. They also shared the experience of bribing officials in order to enter Iraq illegally, getting caught and detained near the Iraqi borders. Sometimes they had to share the experience of risking their lives crossing the crowded Persian Gulf by tiny boats, which sometimes crashed into oil tankers and killed pilgrims. So in a sense, transnational journeys by train and other means provided different groups of Shi'i Iranians a shared experience. Railway travelers sometimes noted the friendly behavior of Iranian passengers in comparison with other passengers like the British. Even an Iranian communist who traveled from Tehran to the Caspian Sea in order to join his global comrades in the Soviet Union said to himself as he saw other Iranians in the railway space, quote, "Where are you going? Aren't you one of these people? Didn't you grow up among these people? Why do you want to abandon all your love of Iran?" End quote. So it was witnessing the familiar sights of his fellow citizens saying farewell to each other on the platform, offering food to each other, ta'arufing and chatting with one another on the railway compartment that strengthened his sense of belonging to the Iranian national community. And that said, railway journeys didn't simply produce a national community. So for example, when an urban professional from Tehran took a southward train in 1945, he was appalled by the vast difference he sensed between himself and most other Iranian passengers. There were so many impoverished pilgrims, young men who were hopeful of interacting with women in compartments. There were people who insisted that they were Dizfulis, right? So people from the city of Dizful, and had no idea that they were indeed Iranians, right? So these were people without national consciousness. And through railway journeys, passengers like him found numerous ways to differentiate themselves from other Iranians, creating a fragmented national community as opposed to the homogeneously westernized citizenry imagined by Pahlavi state supporters. And while this kind of differentiation still assumed the existence of a national community, even that sense of belonging to a nation was destabilized by other senses of belonging that were simultaneously being produced. So for instance, we know that Iranian pilgrims to Iraqi shrine cities were occasionally caught with Soviet propaganda leaflets in their suitcases. And it's possible to interpret incidents like these as indications of how communist Iranians performed transnational pilgrimage as for political purposes. But it's also feasible to think about the possibility of an Iranians to possess a sense of belonging to the transnational communities of Shi'i believers and of communists. So the transnational mobilities produced by the Trans-Iranian Railway were conducive to both a heterogeneous national community and various transnational possibilities. So national space was being stabilized from the very moment of its production. So essentially what we see is the simultaneous production of the local, regional, national, and transnational as concrete categories in travelers' experiences of movement. The transnational connectivity fostered by the railway didn't subsume or weaken local or national, and instead all these different spatial scales were experienced by mobile Iranian travelers simultaneously. And through such experiences of mobility, Iranians became Iranians, but they could also perceive themselves as Desfilis, Shi'is, communists, or possibly all of these at the same time. Okay, so in the book, I discuss more groups I didn't have time to talk about today by weaving together many stories of mobilities. What I try to do is to paint a picture of the railway, this massive project that purported to integrate the nation, not just from the vantage point of the court or Majlis representatives in Tehran, but also from the social and geographical margins of Iran, or even outside of Iran. And by doing so, we see how the exercise of mobility is associated with the railway project produced Iranians not as some sort of homogeneous citizenry, but as intricately differentiated, hierarchized communities. Thank you.
Dr. Koyagi, and the floor is now open for about 20 minutes of Q&A. And what I would ask you to do is to take advantage of the two microphones here in the two aisles. And what we will do is we give the floor alternatingly to people at one and then at the other microphone. Thank you so much.
Yes. Hello. Hi. I have a question. How is the route? Can you comment on how the route of the railroad was chosen? Whether the different places competed with each other to be on the route? Who made the decisions where the railroad went, and how it was ultimately chosen? Yes.
It depended on many factors. Sometimes it was environmental, meaning the ports that were ultimately selected had deeper water level, right? So some of the traditional port cities, both in the north and south, were excluded precisely because of the calculation of the circulation of water and the depth of water. So there is this environmental problem, and there's an issue of cost, which is the reason why the traditional trade route, because if you are moving from Tehran to southern Iran, traditionally, where you would go is go to Ghazvin, and you would go to Hamadan, Kermanshah, and head south, right? But this route was excluded primarily because of the cost issue to draw. The Trans-Iranian Railway went through fairly mountainous areas, but Kermanshah, that area is particularly mountainous, right? So there is the cost issues there. And then there are a local mobilization in terms of the details of the route, whether to go through Khorramshahr, which was one of the initial potential route. There were local merchants who organized for and against Khorramshahr versus Bandar Shahpur. So there were these local petitioning practices that were debated in the higher discussions. Then there are, if you think about the routes, are you thinking more about the sort of the basic line of connecting the Caspian Sea and the Persian Gulf as well?
Well, I meant who also makes the decisions, where it goes? Who makes the decisions, for example, between these different rival groups that want the route to go through their area? Who made the decision?
So it seems that, particularly once we get to the 1930s, the camp sacks did have a pretty major role in determining the routes, because initially there were so many debates, right? Are we going to draw a railway line from east-west, north-south, and if it's north-south, is going to be going through places like Shiraz to Bushehr? So there are all sorts of debates, and those initial discussions were primarily in the Majlis, right? And certain routes, like the Shiraz route, was excluded because of the length of the route and the cost of the construction. But in terms of the more detailed selection of routes, once the terminals of Bandar Shah and Bandar Shahpur were chosen, it was more about sort of issues of technological expertise and cost, right? So the Campsax engineers submitted the cost analysis and benefits analysis, and that was ultimately taken by the railway organization.
I guess the other side's going to not speak right now, but I'll take this one. You've talked a lot about what it's like for like the popular people involved in the building of the railroad, and what it looks like from the sort of elite perspective of like, why are we building this? What's the purpose? But like often organizations are really driven by that sort of middle management of technicians and stuff that have the day-to-day usage are often like the most excited and embedded in that. What does the corporate culture look like for the sort of technicians, engineers, and people running the railroad? What's their sense of mission? What do they get most excited about? What is it like to what are the companies that are doing this, and what's their corporate what's their culture like?
Okay, so I want to talk about maybe two things. One is the question of sources, and so in terms of sources, studies of Iran we have to be very creative in using what kind of resources to use, right? Because of the difficulty with accessing archives or the existence of archives, right? I ultimately didn't get access to the railway organization's library in Tehran, but my suspicion is that there are probably not that many on everyday running of the railway organization anyway. So in terms of like understanding corporate culture, what I used primarily was various publications by the railway organization, where mid-ranking officials, engineers, they have this vision of spreading civilization, the new civilization, Tamadun Jadid, to the countryside, and they try to do it by creating this sort of a more paternalistic organization that takes care of every aspect of workers' lives, right? So throughout the railway route, particularly sort of a new urban centers created by the railway, like Andimeshk, there was a very conscious attempt to create a railway town equipped with all sorts of shopping centers to cinema, employee housing, and various sports facilities. So there's a sense of creating this corporate sense of belonging among workers. So there is this imagination among mid-ranking officials and engineers, but what's also clear is that most of these facilities and forms of leisure were not quite available to average workers because of the chaos of the 1940s in particular. There's rapid inflation and the chaos associated with the occupation. So from workers' perspective, there were all these new facilities advertised in the industry publications, but at the same time, right, this vision that mid-ranking officials had didn't quite reflect the reality of life for many workers, which is partly why there's intensive sort of labor activism among workers by the late 40s.
Sorry, I'm having trouble with the mic. Thank you for a great lecture. And you briefly touched on some aspects of the affected populations and some tensions. And you also talked about how it wasn't really, to say that it was a top-down operation fully would be kind of putting it in a specific category. But were there any specific class or religious? You also talked about the Bazaris who had some issues with the specific plans. Were there any specific tensions or maybe protesting of specific class or a group that was interesting that you came across that kind of changed the direction of the project?
Well, it didn't quite, if you think about the idea of building a railway, protests didn't really do much, right? So in that sort of larger scheme of things, there was no sort of direct incorporation of ideas and complaints from the sort of ordinary people, right? So when I say it's not just top down, I was thinking more about once the infrastructure is there, the material structure of stations and having locomotives and storage facilities, that doesn't necessarily create a functioning infrastructural system. There has to be various regulations. There has to be coordination among different state authorities, and also cooperation by people like camel operators, truck drivers, because railways run from point A to B, but in terms of sending goods from these stations to the rest of the country, you still need larger coordination, right? So when I say it's not just top down, I'm thinking about the sort of everyday functioning of the infrastructural system, not necessarily the initial planning phase. Does that?
I was more thinking about when it, well, obviously the project was going to happen anyway, but through the process or maybe even after, were there specific groups or a class throughout the project that maybe had an effect on it, either directly or indirectly, or was that just not really the case? Because you discussed how the merchants in a specific area were not very pleased with maybe having the railway go through their area. Were there any kind of interests, either class or...
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's another issue with, so I mentioned why, one of the reasons why I wrote so much about the 1940s was because there are many interesting things happening because of the occupation, but also it's a very pragmatic decision. What you see in the 1930s is the increasingly narrow range of opinions you can express in Iran. So in the 1920s, there are these merchants filing petitions and you hear complaints about the particular route, the damage to their properties. But in the 1930s, you don't find a lot of petitions. You don't find organized resistance. And only once you get into the 1940s, that's when the state proclaims, well, those who suffered during the 1930s, you can report it to us and we reconsider your cases, right? So that's when you start to see sort of complaints about the 1930s starting to emerge. But in terms of sort of organized, sort of consistent, sustained resistance, one, there was not that much room in the 1930s, and two, we don't really have sources for that.
Thank you very much for your interesting talk. I was wondering whether you could talk a little bit about gendered mobilities, perhaps whether the railway had a different effect on men versus women in terms of mobility, and whether you see any connection between the modernization efforts of the state, as we see in like women's journals in the early 20th century, whether that was in any way connected to the railway and the mobility of women particularly.
Okay. In terms of gender, I sometimes find it sort of difficult to talk about women because there is a nationalist discourse of how women should travel, right? And then once we start looking at various accounts of how women actually travel, there's a huge disjuncture. So I can talk about how nationalist discourse imagined women as traveling sort of, unveiled, and the railway compartments, the railway cars were not gender segregated, right? And that was one big thing when the railway was being constructed, because the previous experience with the Tehran tramway, it was more gender segregated. So there sort of the Trans-Iranian Railway in that sense did conform to this idea of sort of Iran entering modernity, unveiling, increasing more desegregation, at least in theory. But if you look at how people actually travel, there is a really serious concern from the same nationalist press about women actually traveling unveiled, right? Because that immediately creates a sense of a suspicion, their sexual modesty, honor, and that anxiety is even amplified in the context of the occupation, when there were, in fact, Iranian women who specialized in selling their bodies to the Allied forces. So there is this sort of a nationalist discourse which kind of paradoxically promotes the idea of women being unveiled moving, but at the same time, there is strong anxiety of women actually doing it.
Very interesting, thank you.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I have a question about Andimesh. Because after the discovery of oil in Iran, we see the emergence of company towns created by the British, like Abadan and Machar Suleiman. You briefly touched upon Andimesh as a corporate town. I was wondering if you could expand more on that, because, I mean, were there any foreign workers living in Andimesh, and why Andimesh? Because one could imagine workers would work alongside the railway. Imagining a company town in this context, it's a little bit difficult for me. Yeah, if you could expand.
Right. Well, I mean, in terms of, so places like Abadan, it's a massive company town, right? And there are clear neighborhoods that belong to the European engineers, and there's Indian workers, and then there are Iranians of various ethnic backgrounds living in other quarters. Andimesh is much, much smaller. One fundamental difference between the oil industry and the railway industry is that in the oil industry, there was huge concentration of workers in a very specific part of the country, whereas the railway company had these small pockets all along the route, right? So Andimesh, even though it was a kind of a company town, we are really talking about a very small sort of set of houses for the management class, and there are other houses for sort of really regular workers. And in terms of like the presence of foreign workers, we don't really see it in Andimeshk, partly because the organization started to develop Andimeshk as a city a little bit later in the 40s, whereas foreign presence was more there in the 1930s. So people who talk about Andimeshk in the 1930s, when it was called Salahabad, there were like Italian restaurants or German restaurants that cater to foreign customers. But by the time we get to Andimeshk's development as a city, it's kind of gone.
Thank you.
We have time for one more question.
Thank you for the lecture. Can you tell us about the development of the telegraph and telephone systems that connect these various cities in Iran? To what extent they predated or were concurrent with the development of the railway, and how they related to that development?
So that's another thing that the Iranian case is a little kind of different from many other cases, because typically the telegraph, the railway, these things happen sort of simultaneously in a lot of other historical contexts, but it's also about the historical period in which the railway was constructed, right? In the case of Iran, there were telegraphic systems operating already in the 19th century. And so the railway came after that. So when it did extend the telegraphic system along the route, but it wasn't sort of celebrated as signs of new developments that came with the railway, which was the case with places like India or the Caucasus, where these two things really went hand in hand. And in the case of places like Iran, reflecting the time period in which railway was built, the 1920s and 30s, and then 40s, railway was imagined along with other things like the sewage system, electricity. So these are the sort of imaginations people associate with the railway in the case of Iran.
Well, thank you very much for joining us tonight. I would ask you to give a big round of applause to Dr. Koyagi.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, it is my great pleasure to invite you to a reception outside that is part of the lecture event tonight. I would also like to remind you that Dr. Koyagi is giving another talk here tomorrow at 5:30 p.m. here at City Harbor Center, which is about a different but equally fascinating strand of his work. And the talk is entitled Muhammad, Mesopotamia, and the Making of Pan-Asianism in Imperial Japan. Thank you so much.